proved that on rivers where beavers are, similar type of habitat, you basically get twice as many otters where beavers are and when they're not. It also proved with things like European mink. But I think because waterfalls in this country are a little bit different to our continental waterfalls, I think very, very similar will happen with waterfalls in this country. So we've got, those are the sort of benefits to wildlife that we know can be pretty much proved, but what are the benefits to humans? You know, where's the cash benefit? Where's this ecosystem service? Mostly it's water quality, it's filtration of sediments. There's certain river systems and reservoirs, the benefit of beaver would be worth millions because it costs a fortune to dig out the silt because it all silts up. The filtration of pollutants, the beaver wetlands, you know, the little nodules with all the bacteria, they will process some of the nitrates and phosphates, but some of the pollutants, pesticides, will be fixated into sediments, and that will be turned into peaty soils. You've also got the contribution that beavers play to flood prevention, definitely buffering of rivers across a whole river system, whereby you'll have better flows when there's no water in the summer, and you'll stop peak flows. And that water will recharge aquifers more quickly. There's a number of hydrological benefits that beavers do. And there are a number of economists go around calculating how much all this is worth. So we've got flooding. Is it getting worse? Is it getting better? That's a complex question. The statistics are we've had more clustered effects in the last 30 years of rainfall. But over the last 100 years in Britain, you can't really say if we've had more rainfall or not. So there's no conclusive proof that flooding is getting worse. But this is an example of Boscastle. And there are a number of flood events where we know those flood events have been primarily changed not by rainfall patterns, but by the destruction of the watersheds. So in the moors above Boscastle, they've all been drained. And that water falls upon compacted soils and floods off them straight down into rivers and kills people. And we've got to accept that. There's a number of flood events which are very dangerous to humans, and the cost is tremendous, absolutely tremendous, millions and millions and millions of pounds. So there's a real benefit that beavers could, and other forms of rewilding. So some people across the world have tried to create artificial beavers. This is the town of Belford in Northumberland, very close to where I come from. It started flooding. In the last 20 years, it's flooded a lot. Really nastily. Never used to flood before. It was changes in agricultural drainage. It was intensification of the agriculture. It's a nice small valley, so it's easy to model. But the clever people at the Environment Agency said, we're not going to spend huge amounts of money on flood defences. We're going to create beaver structures. And they are beaver structures. You can see here at the bottom of a farmer's field, they've actually created a beaver pond, just as a beaver would. They have felled trees, which stops high water flows. It points them out into the land and back, and then should go into the ground and not flood down. This, you can't quite see it here, but this is a series of berms and obstacles that makes the water have to go much longer. You've got all the issues with the hydrostatic pressure and the resistance of water. It takes the energy out of the water, it slows it down. And all of this was well studied, and it worked. Stopped the town flooding. But it cost many millions of pounds. Shoving beaver in there. And there's rental charges. They've got to pay the landowner now. So the landowner, he's the one who's drained his land better, that's caused the flooding. He doesn't have to pay for it. And now he's getting a nice bit of rental income from the taxpayer for having a pond at the bottom of his field. That's not fair, is it? Cost benefits analysis, all that kind of stuff. If we start looking at the European Water Framework Directive and its ability to be implemented has been an utter failure in this country. And that's because the structures they want to create along riverbanks, in the watershed, strangely enough, all the sort of things that beavers do. And the cost to do all that is astronomical, both in terms of human beings doing that work, but of course they've got to pay the rental value of the land, or the purchase price of the land, to acquire the ability to do it. And that's the real reason why the Environment Agency has not achieved anything in the Water Frameworks Directive, because they can only buy tiny bits of land which are ineffectual in changing watersheds. So, the best case study in the ecosystem services that Beavers did is the one on the Jossa Valley in Germany. And they calculated that over a 25-year period, it would be worth 15 million euros. And a lot of economists can argue, was it 20 million euros, was it 5 million euros, whatever. And that's the kind of study that's coming through with people who will study ecosystem services. They'll come out and say, these beavers are saving water and preventing flooding and doing things, water treatment, which will end up meaning that it's worth 15 million euros over so many years. But the problem is that's not how the economy works. The other issue I wanted to look at was salmonids and beavers, and why people get so upset, salmon fishers, when studies definitely show us, if we look around those scientific studies that have been done, that most people, where there are beavers around the world, don't think they're a problem. They don't. They've definitely proved that where you have beavers, where beavers in a number of systems have returned, the salmon numbers have gone up, and statistically they're bigger salmon. So there's been a few studies, nothing really conclusive, not enough money doing it. So this was a great study in the, I can't pronounce Norwegian, but over a space of 36 years, no fishermen saw a problem with beavers at all. If we look at the sort of structures that they create, yes, they change rivers, but they're not really stopping salmonids, trouts, and salmon moving up the streams, maybe in a tiny few cases, but statistically a very small amount, but they're changing the habitat. Some habitats, like this one in California, what was a completely useless river is now a great river for trout and salmon, and fantastic. But that's not quite what will happen in Scotland. But we've got to think about the tragedy of the privates. Some of you will have heard of the economic concept of the tragedy of the commons. If you actually read the tragedy of the commons, it's the tragedy of the unmanaged commons. Most commons were very well managed, and they were very, very productive. The tragedy of commons didn't really exist. But we have the tragedy of the privates, and this, I think, is the economic issue with salmonid fishing. You've got the economics of salmon fishing, how people actually make money from salmon fishing, and you've got, they are putting their labour and their capital into trying to create something, a fishing experience that's worth a lot of money. People will pay unfathomable amounts of money to go and catch the right salmon. And if you've provided that labour and that capital to give your client the most fantastic experience in salmon fishing, that's great, and we should promote that. And we know generally across a river system, having beavers back will actually create more opportunities to fish. The problem is that with salmon fishing and trout fishing, you need the perfect bit where the salmon want to stop and avoid predation and be able to feed just right. Now, the beavers might move that 200 yards down, and that's not your land anymore. And you can't charge boat licenses. And that's the tragedy of the privates. The reason why the Angling Trust and our friends in the Tweed Foundation are so upset is not because they really disagree that beavers will destroy their fishing industry. It's because they're worried that their personal income of their business is going to be affected. And so we need an economic system that rewards the labour and the capital employed, but gives greater mobility to the actual natural resource. The ownership of the natural resource becomes less important. That's how you solve the problem with fishing. So people won't scream and shout and hire PR people and fund organisations to come along and say, beavers are a terrible idea, because they can still ply their trade. Mitigation and compensation strategies. The economic processes that we need to understand so we can rightly mitigate and transfer from those who benefit and those who lose out in beaver restoration. So the first thing, we've got to understand the role of land and economic rent, because who benefits when beavers recolonise the Tay catchment? Where does the money come out? It comes out in the rental value, mostly of Perth properties that aren't going to be footed anymore, that they have cheaper water bills and their insurance costs have done down. Also, those houses next to areas that look a bit nicer will have the rental value of that land. It's capital value. It's easier to measure rental value than economic. And so we like to talk about economic rent. They benefit. It is immaterial if you create more jobs, because the way the economy works is the competition for jobs that decides wages is different to what the ecosystem services are. So the person who benefits are property owners, and normally quite a few property owners, who will benefit hugely from the return of the beavers in certain points, mostly build-up areas, because that's where the true uplift in land values occurs. So you need a system that takes it from them and gives it to the poor farmer who's had his potato field flooded. And that's, the problem is, at the moment, the way we compensate people from general taxation means that we suppress jobs. We will create poverty when you tax people's labour and their capital, because there's less jobs around, there's less economic activity. So people fundamentally know that the system is broken when it comes to economics of reward, of cost and benefit. And you can't just say that, yes, we're going to get all these benefits from beavers, and then we're going to tax everybody and give it to the farmer. And also you have to say, well, that farmer took that land from the floodplain in the first place, so he's caused costs to other people. So you really need a system that can understand who benefits and who loses. And that's what economics teaches us. Now, there's two ways of benefiting. One is mitigation. You can see here where there's a simple, where you've got a sluice. You build a beautiful beaver deceiver and use funds from people who've benefited to pay for things like that. And a beaver deceiver like that will really work. It does work. It'll solve all your problems. And in certain areas, this is what you want to do. You want to mitigate. And the way you decide what is mitigation and what is compensation is a different matter. We've also got areas where beavers will come and damage crops. Now, an electric fence is quite effective in that. In certain areas, you want to maximise the benefit of that farming. We know that beavers very rarely venture far from riverbanks. Probably having 20 metres of riparian habitat will solve a lot of problems anyway. How do we get that from the landowners who use it and get it back to the wild, and how do we compensate it? Again, it's transferring the money from those who really benefit to those who lose it. And also, we can always remove beavers. So the Bavarian model of mitigation is great. We need cash compensation reflecting the rental value exchange from the winners and the losers. And how we decide between the two processes is we need a fluid